Chapter 1. A Boy from the Countryside. It was a quiet village, far from the bustling cities of France. No grand buildings, no famous landmarks, just simple homes, small farms, and people who live by the sweat of their brows. This was Dole. Here, among the scent of fresh earth and worn leather, a boy was born. A boy named Louis Pasteur. The year was 1822, a time when few understood the world beyond their daily lives, where the secrets of the universe lay hidden in plain sight. Louis's father, Jean-Joseph, worked as a tanner. His hands, thick, calloused, stained with the work of shaping leather, day in and day out. His mother, Jeanne, was gentle, her life dedicated to her children and her home. She loved her son deeply, but even she could not have imagined the future that awaited him. Louis was a quiet boy. Unlike the other children, he didn't spend his time playing in the fields or running through the village streets. No, Louis was different. He observed the world, watched it closely, as if it were a puzzle to be solved. His eyes would often drift to the sky, wondering about the mysteries that lay beyond the clouds. What was out there? Why did things work the way they did? As a young child, Louis didn't have much. His family was not wealthy. They were simple people. Their small home stood near the workshop where his father labored. Every day, the air was filled with the smell of treated hides. The strong, heavy scent of leather mixed with the earthy smells of the village. For Louis, this was the scent of hard work, of survival. But even as a child, he felt deep in his heart that there was more to life than this. Something bigger. Something waiting to be discovered. He would sit for hours near the river, watching the water rush by, the tiny ripples on its surface. How could something so simple be so powerful? He saw the insects dancing on the water, their legs so light that they didn't even break the surface. How? He wondered. Why? His mind was always filled with questions that no one in his small village could answer. But life in Dole wasn't just peaceful. It was hard. There was always work to be done. Louis's father expected him to help in the workshop, to learn the craft of tanning, to follow in his footsteps. But Louis, he was not like his father. His hands, though willing, were not meant for leather. His mind, it wandered, always drifting to the unknown, to the world beyond the tools and hides. He would help, but his thoughts, they were far away. Still, there was love in their home. Jean-Joseph Pasteur was a man of principle, a man who believed in hard work, honesty, and respect. He wanted the best for his son, but he knew Louis was different. He saw it in the way his son looked at the world, the way his eyes would light up when he talked about his curiosities. There was a spark in him, a flame that Jean-Joseph didn't quite understand, but he respected it. And though he couldn't guide Louis into the world of science, he gave him something just as important. He taught him discipline, patience, the value of determination. As Louis grew older, his curiosity only deepened. He would ask questions that no one around him could answer. Why does bread rise when it's baked? What makes wine sour? Why do some people get sick while others stay healthy? These were simple questions, but no one had simple answers. Not in Dole, not in 1822. At school, Louis struggled. He wasn't the brightest student, not at first. His mind, always elsewhere, made it difficult for him to focus on the lessons in front of him. His teachers, they didn't see the brilliance hiding beneath his quiet exterior. They saw a boy who was distracted, a boy who wasn't like the others. He was an average student with average grades. But Louis, he didn't care about the numbers on his report card. He cared about something bigger. He just didn't know what it was yet. And so, in those early years, life in Dole continued. The seasons changed. The village stayed the same. But inside Louis, there was a storm brewing. A quiet storm. One that would not be satisfied with the simple answers of a small town. It wasn't until one fateful day, sitting by the river, that something changed. Louis had been watching the water, the insects again, when he saw something he hadn't noticed before. The way the sunlight hit the surface, it made the water shimmer as if it were alive. He stared, transfixed. There's something there, he thought. Something more. But what? It was a small moment, insignificant to anyone else. But for Louis, it was a moment of awakening. He realized then that his questions mattered, that the world wasn't just as it seemed, that there were forces, ideas, truths hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. He wanted to know. He needed to know. And so, as the years passed, Louis's desire to learn only grew stronger. His parents didn't fully understand his fascination with science, but they supported him. They wanted him to succeed, to find his path, even if it wasn't the one they had imagined for him. By the time he was a teenager, it became clear. Louis Pasteur would not stay in Dole forever. His heart, his mind, belonged elsewhere. To the mysteries of nature, to the wonders of science. He would leave the village behind, but he would never forget where he came from. This small boy from a simple family in a quiet village would one day change the world. But in this moment, standing by the river, watching the sunlight dance on the water, he was just Louis, a boy with a head full of questions and a heart that beat with the promise of discovery. The world had no idea what was coming, and neither did he. Chapter 2. Curiosity Sparked by Nature. The world of a child is often small, familiar streets, the same faces, the same sounds. But for Louis Pasteur, that world felt limitless. His small village of Dole, with its winding river and quiet fields, was not just home. To him, it was an endless mystery, waiting to be solved. And every day, as he grew, so did the questions that filled his mind. He was different from the other children. While they ran and laughed, their faces full of carefree joy, Louis could often be found sitting alone, quietly observing. His favorite place was the river. He would sit by its edge for hours, his eyes fixed on the flowing water. The river's gentle current seemed to carry his thoughts, deeper and deeper. What made the water move like that? What lay beneath its surface, hidden from view? And the insects, those tiny creatures that skimmed across the water's surface, their legs so light they barely made a ripple. How did they do that? Why is it like this? He would whisper to himself. He wasn't like the other children. They didn't wonder about the world the way he did. Louis's mind was restless, full of thoughts that wouldn't leave him alone. The natural world around him. It was alive in ways he couldn't quite understand. His father often called for him, Jean-Joseph, a hard-working man who wanted his son to follow in his footsteps, to learn the trade of tanning. But even when Louis was helping with the leather, his hands busy, his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking of the river, the insects, the patterns in the clouds above. Why? He would ask himself. How? One warm afternoon, while the village seemed to sleep under the heavy sun, Louis returned to his river. The water sparkled as the sunlight hit it, and for a moment it seemed like the whole world was made of tiny stars. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he tried to focus on a single drop of water. It was so small. Yet inside that drop, there had to be something more. He could feel it. Louis didn't know it then, but his mind was already working like a scientist's. He wasn't satisfied with the surface of things. He wanted to look deeper, to understand the invisible forces that shaped the world. And nature, it seemed, was full of lessons. The trees, tall and unmoving, would sway ever so slightly when the wind blew. Why? The birds chirping in the distance, each with a song of its own. How? Everywhere he looked, nature whispered to him, teasing him with its secrets. Louis. He wanted to know them all. He watched as the seasons changed. The river froze in winter, only to melt again in spring. He marveled at the way the flowers would bloom, then wither, only to come alive once more the next year. Life, death, rebirth. There was a pattern, a rhythm to it all. But what was the source? What made it all happen? Louis couldn't rest until he found out. His teachers at school, they didn't see what he saw. To them, he was just a quiet boy with average marks. They taught him math, history, language. But Louis wanted more than facts and figures. He wanted answers. Real answers. But who could give them to him? In those days, no one spoke of bacteria, of microbes, of the tiny life forms that were all around us. The invisible world was unknown. And yet, Louis felt its presence, as if the world he could see was only a fraction of what truly existed. One day, as he sat by the river, his father found him. Jean-Joseph, strong and stern, looked down at his son and sighed. "Louis," he said, "you must learn to work, not dream." Louis didn't answer. How could he explain the thoughts that filled his mind? How could he tell his father about the questions that wouldn't leave him alone? But his father didn't understand. Not yet. As the years passed, Louis's curiosity only deepened. He began to collect things. Rocks, leaves, even small insects. He would study them, turning them over in his hands, looking for clues. What made a rock hard, while a leaf was soft? What gave life to an insect, but not to a stone? Sometimes, he would ask his mother. Jean, always kind, would listen patiently as he talked about the world's mysteries. She didn't have the answers, but she would smile and say, "You're going to do something special, Louis. I just know it." Her words gave him strength, but there were still no answers. And then, one day, something remarkable happened. Louis, now a bit older, had ventured farther from the village than he ever had before. The river had led him into a forest, where the trees stood tall and the air was cool. As he wandered through the woods, he came upon something strange. A small pool of water, still and quiet. Above it, a strange mist hung in the air. He crouched down, peering into the water. It was so clear, so calm, that he could see straight to the bottom. And there, in the stillness, something moved. Tiny creatures, so small they were almost invisible, darted back and forth. Louis's heart raced. He leaned in closer and closer. What are they?" he breathed. They were alive, little creatures living in the water, too small to be seen without looking closely. Louis felt his pulse quicken. He didn't know what they were, but he knew, in that moment, that the world was far more complex than he had ever imagined. There were things, living things, that people couldn't see. And yet, they were there, all the same. He ran home that day, breathless with excitement, his mind filled with new possibilities. What if there were more of these tiny creatures? What if they existed everywhere, not just in the water? Louis's questions multiplied, just as life did in the world around him. And so, a quiet, curious boy from the countryside began to walk a path that would one day lead him to answers. Answers that would change the course of history. Answers that would save lives and unlock the secrets of the unseen world. But on that day, by the river, watching the dance of insects and the shimmer of water, Louis Pasteur's journey had only just begun. The world was waiting for him, and he was ready to explore it. Chapter 3. The Struggles of Youth, the Early Years. They were not kind to Louis Pasteur. School was a battle, a daily struggle, one that seemed never-ending. He wasn't like the other students, not at first. The lessons didn't come easily to him. While others raced through their studies, their heads full of answers, Louis was left behind. The numbers, the equations, the sentences, they all seemed to twist and turn in his mind, refusing to settle. The classroom, with its rows of desks and the sound of chalk scratching against the board, felt like a prison. And Louis, he was trapped inside. Failure. It clung to him like a shadow. No matter how hard he tried, the marks on his report card told the same story. Not good enough. His teachers, they doubted him. "Louis," they would say, shaking their heads, "he's a bright boy, but he's just not cut out for this." Those words, whispered in the corners of the classroom, spoken behind his back, stung. Louis heard them all. Every doubt, every sigh of disappointment. It echoed in his ears. But there was something inside him, something stronger than the doubts, stronger than the failure. Determination. While others may have been discouraged, Louis wasn't. He would come home after school, his head bowed, but his heart was burning. He refused to believe that he wasn't good enough. He knew, deep inside, that there was something in him that the others couldn't see. His father, Jean-Joseph, was a stern man. He expected hard work, discipline, but even he was worried. "Louis," he said one evening, as the boy sat at the kitchen table staring at his school books, maybe this path is not for you." His voice was kind but heavy with concern. Louis looked up, his eyes tired but fierce. "No, father," he said, his voice steady, despite the weight of failure. "I'll get it. I will." Jean-Joseph watched his son, the fire in his eyes, and he nodded. "All right, Louis," he said quietly. "Prove them wrong." And Louis, he intended to do just that. But the road wasn't easy. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The lessons continued, and so did the struggles. Louis worked harder than ever, staying up late into the night, his candle burning down to a stub as he tried to understand the mysteries of science and mathematics. The frustration built inside him. There were moments when he wanted to throw his books aside, to walk away, to give up. But every time that thought crept into his mind, he would remember his father's words. Prove them wrong. And so, he kept going. The turning point came. One cold winter afternoon. Louis was sitting at his desk, hunched over a chemistry textbook. The words blurred before his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him. But suddenly, something clicked. It was as if a light had switched on in his mind. The numbers, the symbols, they made sense. For the first time, Louis felt the pieces fall into place. His heart raced, his hands trembled as he scribbled down notes, solving problem after problem. He couldn't believe it. He understood. It wasn't a sudden miracle. No, far from it. But that moment, it changed everything. Louis had tasted what it felt like to get it, to understand something that had once seemed impossible. And with that taste came hunger. From that day on, Louis approached his studies with new energy. He was still behind the others, still struggling. But now he had hope. He knew that if he worked hard enough, if he kept pushing, the answers would come. The hours spent at his desk grew longer, the nights shorter. While his classmates rested, confident in their abilities, Louis was working, always working. And little by little, his grades improved. His teachers, who had once doubted him, began to notice. He's getting better, they whispered. One teacher in particular saw the change. A chemistry instructor who had been watching Louis from the back of the room noticed the quiet determination in his eyes. He called Louis to his desk one afternoon. "Pasteur," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You've been working hard." Louis nodded, unsure of where the conversation was going. The teacher leaned forward. "You've got something, boy. A spark. You're not like the others." Louis blinked, surprised. No one had ever said that to him before. "You struggle, yes," the teacher continued, "but you're not afraid of the struggle. That's what makes you different. That's what will take you far, if you keep at it." The words lit a fire in Louis's heart. Someone believed in him. Someone saw what he had always known, deep inside. And so, he kept going. The next few years were a blur of effort and frustration, of small victories and setbacks. But Louis never gave up. The more he learned, the more his curiosity grew. Science, which had once seemed like a wall he couldn't climb, was now a doorway to something much bigger. There were still failures, many of them, but now Louis didn't fear failure. He saw it as part of the process, as something that would shape him, mold him into something stronger. Every mistake, every setback, it was a lesson. And Louis was learning. By the time he left school, Louis Pasteur was no longer the struggling boy who had once doubted himself. He was still quiet, still thoughtful, but inside, there was a new strength. He had proven them wrong, but more importantly, he had proven something to himself. The world was vast, full of mysteries yet to be uncovered, and Louis knew that he was destined to uncover them. The struggles of youth had shaped him, but they hadn't broken him. They had forged him into someone who would not be stopped. Louis Pasteur was ready for whatever came next, ready to change the world. Chapter 4. A Turning Point. Sometimes, life changes in a single moment. For Louis Pasteur, that moment came when he met him, his mentor, the man who would change the course of his life forever. Louis had always been curious, always full of questions, but for so long his mind had been trapped. Science was there, right in front of him, but it felt like a locked door. He knew there was something amazing on the other side, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find the key. And then he appeared, Louis's chemistry teacher, a man whose name would forever be etched into his memory. Monsieur Jean-Baptiste Dumas. He was a tall man with a sharp gaze and a commanding presence. The moment he stepped into the classroom, there was an energy about him, something that made the students sit up straighter, pay attention. But it wasn't fear. No, it was something else. Monsieur Dumas had a passion for chemistry that was infectious. He didn't just teach science, he lived it. And for the first time, Louis felt the pull of that passion, the thrill of discovery. He watched Dumas with wide eyes, hanging on his every word. This wasn't like the dull, dry lessons Louis had struggled through before. No, this was something different. It was as if Dumas could see the world at a level no one else could. He would talk about atoms, about the forces that shape the universe, and his voice would tremble with excitement. Everything, Dumas would say, his eyes gleaming. Everything is connected. Molecules, elements, they are the building blocks of life itself. And Louis, he was captivated. There was something about Dumas, something that drew Louis in. The way he explained the world. It was as if he were revealing a secret, something hidden beneath the surface. Louis had always felt that pull, that hunger to understand the unseen. But Dumas, he gave it form. He gave it direction. One day, after class, Dumas called Louis over. His heart raced as he walked to the front of the room, unsure of what to expect. "Pasteur," Dumas said, his voice firm but kind, "I've been watching you." Louis blinked, his hands twisting nervously at his sides. "You have something," Dumas continued, his gaze piercing. "Something special. I see it in the way you look at the experiments, the way you think." Louis's breath caught in his throat. No one had ever said that to him before. Dumas leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You may not be the fastest in the classroom, but that doesn't matter. What matters is your curiosity. Never lose that, Pasteur. It's the most powerful tool you have." Louis nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to say, but he didn't need to. For the first time, someone had seen him, truly seen him. Not as the struggling student, but as someone with potential. From that day on, everything changed. Suddenly, the world of science came alive to Louis in a way it never had before. Molecules, atoms, reactions. They weren't just abstract ideas anymore. They were pieces of a grand puzzle, waiting to be put together. Under Dumas' guidance, Louis began to thrive. He stayed late after class, working through problems, performing experiments, losing himself in the wonders of chemistry. The lab, once a place of frustration, became his sanctuary. His hands, once unsure and shaky, now moved with confidence as he mixed chemicals, measured solutions, and watched as the reactions unfolded before his eyes. And with every experiment, Louis felt that spark of curiosity grow stronger. The more he learned, the more he wanted to learn. It was no longer about passing exams or proving himself to his teachers. It was about something much bigger. He wanted to understand the world, to uncover its secrets, to see what others couldn't. And chemistry was the key. He was hooked. The turning point came one afternoon, as Louis stood in the lab, watching a beaker bubble softly on the burner. Dumas stood beside him, watching in silence. Louis was deep in concentration, his mind racing with possibilities. And then, it happened. The solution in the beaker began to change color, shifting from clear to a deep, vibrant blue. Louis's eyes widened in amazement. How? He whispered, unable to tear his eyes away. Dumas smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. That, Pasteur, he said, his voice soft, is the magic of chemistry. Louis stared at the beaker, his heart pounding with excitement. It wasn't just a reaction, it was proof. Proof that the world could change in ways you couldn't see coming. And in that moment, Louis realized something. He didn't just want to learn science. He wanted to do science. He wanted to be a part of something bigger than himself, to make discoveries that could change the world. Dumas must have seen the look in his eyes, because he placed a hand on Louis's shoulder and said, "You're going to go far, Pasteur. But remember, curiosity alone isn't enough. You need discipline, focus, and above all, patience." Louis nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead, filled with thoughts of experiments, of discoveries yet to be made. From that day on, Louis threw himself into his studies with a new kind of energy. He no longer feared failure, no longer doubted himself, because now he had a mentor, someone who believed in him, and that belief, it changed everything. It wasn't long before Louis's classmates began to notice. The quiet boy who had once struggled to keep up was now leading the way. His hands moved confidently in the lab. His notes were detailed, precise. He was no longer just a student. He was a scientist in the making. The world of molecules and elements, once so distant and confusing, was now clear. Louis could see the connections, the patterns, the beauty of it all. And the more he learned, the more he realized. This was just the beginning. The boy who had once struggled to find his place was now driven by ambition. He had found his path, and nothing would stop him from walking it. Louis Pasteur was ready for what came next, and the world had no idea what was coming. Chapter 5. Paris Beckons. The train came to a slow, screeching halt, and there it was, Paris, the city of lights, the city of dreams, the city where brilliant minds gathered to reshape the world. Louis Pasteur stood at the edge of the platform, his heart pounding, his breath caught in his throat. This was the moment. He had made it. Stepping off the train, his suitcase in hand, Louis looked around in awe. The city buzzed with life. People rushing by, horse-drawn carriages clattering on cobblestone streets, and the air filled with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and the occasional shout of a street vendor. Paris was alive, and it was overwhelming. For a moment Louis felt small, so very small. The streets stretched out before him like endless rivers of stone, each one teeming with people, with stories, with lives. Would there be a place for him here? Would he, a quiet boy from a small village, find a way to make his mark in such a grand, towering city? He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "You're here to learn," he whispered under his breath. "You're here for a reason." He had left his home in Dole, left behind the familiar faces, the quiet countryside. Now he was in Paris, the center of ideas and innovation. He was ready, or at least he hoped he was. The first stop on his journey? The École Normale Supérieure, a prestigious institution where only the best minds were invited to study. And Louis? He was one of them. But as he made his way through the crowded streets, weaving between carriages and pedestrians, doubt began to creep in. What if he wasn't ready? What if the other students were smarter, quicker, more talented than him? What if Paris swallowed him whole, like so many before him? Shaking off the doubts, he pressed forward. This was no time for fear. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to be here. Failure was not an option. As he neared the towering buildings of the École Normale Supérieure, his pulse quickened. The grandeur of it all, tall, imposing structures filled with classrooms and laboratories, all designed to push the boundaries of knowledge. It was magnificent, but it was also intimidating. Inside, the halls echoed with the footsteps of students, their voices filled with excitement, with ambition. The air crackled with the energy of ideas being born, discoveries waiting to be made. Louis could feel it in his bones. This was a place where minds collided, where theories were tested, and where only the strongest ideas survived. He was here to learn, yes, but he was also here to prove himself. His first days at the école were a whirlwind of activity. Lectures filled with equations that made his head spin, professors who spoke with such confidence, and fellow students, brilliant students, who seemed to grasp concepts in a way Louis could only dream of. At first he felt out of place. He was quiet, an observer. He would sit in the back of the lecture hall, furiously scribbling notes, trying to keep up. But no matter how hard he worked, it felt like he was always a step behind. The city itself seemed to reflect his struggle. Paris was beautiful, yes, but it was also fast, relentless. There was no time to stop, no time to rest. And Louis, he could feel the pressure mounting. There were nights when he would return to his small room, exhausted, his mind buzzing with information, his body worn out. The streets of Paris, once so full of life, now seemed cold, indifferent. And yet, something inside him refused to give up. He remembered Dumas' words, his mentor's voice echoing in his mind. Curiosity alone isn't enough, Pasteur. You need discipline, focus, and above all, patience. Patience. Louis would not let the immensity of Paris crush him. He had come here for a reason, and he would not leave until he had fulfilled it. Slowly, things began to change. He found a rhythm, a way to navigate the chaos of the city and the demands of his studies. In the laboratory, where chemicals bubbled and reactions sparked, he felt at home. His hands, once unsure, now moved with purpose. The concepts that had once seemed out of reach began to make sense. And then, something remarkable happened. It was during a chemistry lecture. The professor stood at the front, explaining the properties of certain compounds, his voice steady but dry. Louis listened, as he always did, but this time, something clicked. The words didn't just float in and out of his mind, they stuck. The world of molecules, atoms, reactions. Suddenly, it wasn't just theory anymore. It was real. Louis could see it, could understand it. It was as if a door had opened, and behind it, the secrets of the universe were waiting for him. His heart raced with excitement. The feeling was intoxicating. He had glimpsed the inner workings of the world, and he wanted more. From that moment on, Louis attacked his studies with a renewed energy. He stayed late in the lab, working long after the other students had left. He asked questions, pushed boundaries, tested theories. Paris no longer seemed overwhelming. Now it was a playground of ideas, a city full of opportunities waiting to be seized. His professors noticed the change. They saw the quiet student from the back of the room transform into a driven young man, hungry for knowledge. His experiments grew bolder, his questions sharper. The students who had once seemed far ahead of him now saw him as an equal. Paris was no longer a place to fear. It was a place to conquer. In the evenings, as Louis walked through the streets, past the cafes filled with poets and philosophers, he felt a new sense of belonging. The city that had once seemed so vast, so cold, now felt alive with possibility. He had found his place, but Louis knew this was only the beginning. Paris had opened his mind to a world of science he had only dreamed of. But there was still so much more to discover. With each passing day, his ambition grew. He wasn't just here to study. He was here to make a difference. Paris, the city of lights, the city of dreams, had welcomed him. And now, it was time for Louis Pasteur to shine. Chapter 6. The Invisible Enemy. In the world of science, sometimes the greatest dangers are the ones you cannot see. Louis Pasteur, with his sharp mind and relentless curiosity, had already begun to unlock the secrets of chemistry. But there was something more, something lurking beneath the surface, unseen by the naked eye. He had felt it for a long time, that there were forces at work, forces no one could understand. Yet, it all began with a simple question. Why did wine turn sour? Why did milk spoil? Why did some foods rot while others stayed fresh? The world accepted it as nature's way, as if it was simply fate. But not Louis. No, he wanted to know. He had spent hours in his lab, watching as liquids changed before his eyes, as once clear solutions became cloudy, murky, spoiled. The answers weren't obvious, but Louis knew one thing: something was causing it. Something small, something invisible. He began his research with an intensity that startled even his professors. He was driven, almost obsessed with finding out what was behind the spoiling of food and drink. Hours stretched into days, days into nights, as he peered into his microscope, searching for clues. And then, one day, he found it. Tiny, moving creatures, so small they could only be seen through the lens of his microscope. There, in the cloudy liquid, were bacteria. At first, Louis couldn't believe it. How could something so small and so insignificant have such a massive impact? But there they were, millions of them, multiplying, consuming, spreading, the invisible enemy. He leaned closer, watching in awe as these tiny organisms moved and swarmed. This is the answer, he whispered to himself. The bacteria were alive and active, working silently, unseen by the rest of the world. But now Louis knew. It was a revelation. The bacteria weren't just spoiling food. They were everywhere. In the air, in the water, on surfaces, inside people's bodies. They were all around us, yet no one had ever known. It was as if he had discovered a hidden battlefield, one where the enemy was too small to see, but powerful enough to destroy. Louis stood in the lab, his heart racing. He had seen the invisible enemy with his own eyes, but how could he fight something so small? He couldn't simply stop them by force. No, he needed to be smarter. As he delved deeper into his research, he realized that these bacteria were responsible for much more than spoiled wine. They were linked to disease, illness, death. The implications were terrifying. At the time, the world didn't understand. Most people believed that sickness came from bad air or curses, that disease was an inevitable part of life. But Louis knew better. He had seen the true enemy, and now he needed to convince the world. But that was easier said than done. The scientific community wasn't ready to accept his findings. Tiny creatures, they scoffed. Invisible enemies? Nonsense. They laughed at the idea that something so small could cause so much damage. But Louis, he didn't laugh. He knew what he had seen. Doubt crept in from every corner. His peers didn't believe him. They ridiculed his ideas, dismissed his research. But Louis, he wasn't easily discouraged. He knew he was onto something revolutionary, something that could change the world. He returned to his lab with renewed determination. The microscopes, the petri dishes, the experiments, he worked tirelessly, sometimes going without sleep, pushing himself to the limit. He needed proof, undeniable proof, that bacteria were not just a nuisance, but a deadly force. And slowly, that proof began to emerge. He began to experiment with heat. If bacteria could be killed by heat, then perhaps he could stop them. He tested it, heating liquids to a specific temperature, and when he examined the samples afterward, the bacteria were gone. He had found a way to fight back. Pasteurization, he called it, a method that would one day save lives, prevent disease, and protect food from spoilage. The discovery was simple, yet profound. By heating liquids, he could kill the invisible enemy, making food and drink safer for everyone. But this was just the beginning. Louis began to wonder, if bacteria could spoil food, could they also cause sickness in humans? Could the diseases that ravaged villages, the plagues that swept through cities, be caused by these invisible invaders? He had a theory, but theories weren't enough. He needed to prove it. And so, the next phase of his journey began. He would explore the connection between bacteria and disease, but this was dangerous territory. Many still held onto old beliefs, superstitions, ancient ideas about disease. But Louis was ready to challenge them all. He worked relentlessly, conducting experiment after experiment, searching for the truth. And slowly, the world began to take notice. His discoveries were too important to ignore. The laughter and ridicule faded away, replaced by curiosity and respect. Louis Pasteur was no longer just a student or a young researcher. He was a pioneer, a man who had seen what others could not. He had found the enemy, and now he was fighting back. The road ahead would be difficult. There were more battles to be fought, more mysteries to be uncovered. But Louis knew one thing for certain. He had taken the first step in a journey that would change the world. The invisible enemy was no longer a secret. And now, humanity had a chance to fight back. Louis Pasteur stood at the edge of a new era, his mind filled with the possibilities of what he could achieve. He had seen the unseen, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 7. The Quest for Truth. Louis Pasteur worked day and night. His world had become the lab, endless hours surrounded by glass beakers, bubbling solutions, and the faint, sharp smell of chemicals. His hands were always stained, his mind constantly whirling with ideas. There was no rest, no pause. He was a man on a mission. The mystery of fermentation gnawed at him, a puzzle that refused to leave him in peace. How did wine turn sour? Why did milk spoil? What was happening inside these simple liquids that turned them from something fresh into something foul? These were questions no one could answer. Yet. But Louis, he was determined to find out. He had already discovered the tiny creatures, bacteria, that lived in the air, in the water, in food, and inside of us. He knew they were responsible for the spoilage, but he needed to understand how. What were these bacteria doing? What invisible war was being waged beneath the surface? His lab was a battlefield. He stood at the front lines, eyes peering through the lens of his microscope, watching as the tiny creatures moved, multiplied, consumed, changed everything they touched. The more he saw, the clearer it became. Fermentation was not some mysterious magical process. It wasn't just a natural change. No, there was something far more precise at work. It was the bacteria. The moment this realization hit him, it was as if a veil had been lifted. All those spoiled barrels of wine, all the soured milk. The answer had been there, hiding in plain sight, invisible to everyone but him. Bacteria, he whispered, his breath catching in his throat. They're the key. They control everything. But with this discovery came a terrifying thought. If these tiny creatures could spoil wine and sour milk, what else could they do? What other havoc could they wreak? Louis felt a chill run down his spine. The bacteria weren't just enemies of food. They were enemies of life itself. Disease. The word echoed in his mind, heavy with meaning. What if bacteria were responsible for more than spoilage? What if they were behind the sicknesses that ravaged families, villages, entire cities? What if these invisible creatures were causing the fevers, the infections, the deaths that no one could explain? Louis felt the weight of this question settle on him like a dark cloud. He couldn't ignore it. He had to know. He had to find the truth. But the world was not ready for this idea. His peers, the scientists and doctors of the time, still clung to old beliefs. They spoke of miasmas, bad air, as the cause of disease. They believed in curses, in imbalances of the body's fluids, in ancient theories that had never been questioned. And now, here was Louis Pasteur, suggesting that the real enemy was something so small, so invisible, it could barely be seen at all. The skepticism was immediate. Bacteria causing disease, they scoffed. Ridiculous, absurd. The laughter, the dismissals, they came from all sides. Louis heard their words, felt their doubt pressing in on him like a suffocating fog. But inside, he was burning with certainty. He knew he was right. He had seen it with his own eyes. So he pushed on. Day after day, night after night, Louis stayed in the lab, testing, experimenting, questioning. His hands were raw from the constant work, his eyes tired from peering through the microscope, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The fermentation experiments were his focus. He studied yeast, watched how it interacted with sugars, how it transformed liquids into alcohol. But when things went wrong, when wine turned sour, he looked deeper. And there they were, bacteria, the invisible enemy, silently corrupting everything. It became clear that these bacteria didn't just appear by chance. They were introduced, carried by air, by dust, by contamination. And once they were in, they took over, spreading like an invisible army, unstoppable unless you knew how to fight them. His heart raced with the implications. If he could control the bacteria, if he could stop them from spreading, then he could stop spoilage. He could save wine, milk, beer, and maybe, just maybe, he could stop disease. But how? Heat. It was a simple idea, but brilliant in its elegance. Louis realized that by heating liquids to a certain temperature, he could kill the bacteria without destroying the liquid itself. It wasn't magic. It was science. Pasteurization, he called it. A word that would one day become famous. A word that would save countless lives. But even as he celebrated this breakthrough, the larger question remained. What else, he wondered, are these invisible enemies doing to the world? He thought of the sick children, the infected wounds, the fevers that ravaged entire communities. Could bacteria? Could these same tiny creatures be the cause? Could they be behind the diseases that doctors still couldn't explain? It was a terrifying thought, but one that Louis could not shake. He knew he was on the edge of something monumental, something that would change the way the world understood life and death. But the road ahead would not be easy. The doubt, the skepticism. It was still there, looming like a dark shadow over his work. He knew that convincing the world of his discoveries would be the greatest challenge of his life. Yet, he pressed on. The quest for truth was not something Louis Pasteur could walk away from. It had gripped him, consumed him. He could see the answers just beyond the horizon, and no matter how long it took, no matter how many nights he spent in the lab, he would find them. The world was still blind to the invisible enemy, but Louis, he was not. And with each discovery, each breakthrough, the truth came closer, step by step. Louis Pasteur was a man on a mission, and the invisible enemy had no idea what was coming. The battle had only just begun. Chapter 8. The Power of Heat, the Birth of Pasteurization. One discovery led to another. Louis Pasteur, tirelessly working in his lab, had already uncovered the hidden world of bacteria, those invisible enemies that could spoil wine, sour milk, and wreak havoc on anything they touched. But understanding the enemy wasn't enough. He needed a way to stop them. For weeks, maybe months, Louis's mind churned with questions. How could he fight something so small? How could he protect food, drink, and perhaps even lives from these microscopic invaders? The answer came quietly at first, like a whisper in the back of his mind. Heat. Could it really be that simple? Louis had observed that when he applied heat to certain substances, the bacteria disappeared, died. But could he refine this process? Could he use it in a way that didn't destroy the very thing he was trying to protect? He returned to his lab, more determined than ever. In front of him, a beaker of cloudy wine sat bubbling, filled with the same bacteria that had turned barrels of wine into vinegar. He lit the flame beneath it, carefully watching the temperature rise. Slowly, steadily. His heart pounded with every passing second. Would it work? Could heat be the answer? When the liquid reached a certain temperature, Louis extinguished the flame. He let the wine cool, his mind racing, his hands trembling with anticipation. This was it. And then he peered into the microscope. The bacteria. They were gone. His breath caught in his throat. Gone. The tiny invaders that had once been thriving in the liquid were no more. It was as if he had found the key to an invisible lock. Heat could kill them. But the wine, had it been ruined? He tasted it, and to his astonishment it was still good. The flavor, the essence, everything was intact. It hadn't spoiled, it hadn't soured, it was saved. Louis stood still, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had found it, the solution to spoilage, the method that could stop bacteria from destroying food and drink. Heat. It was as simple as heating the liquid to the right temperature, just enough to kill the bacteria, but not enough to ruin the flavor. He tested it again and again. Milk, beer, even vinegar. Every time, the same result. the harmful bacteria were eliminated and the product remained perfectly safe to consume. This was the birth of pasteurization. The discovery was humble, yes, but it was also profound. Louis had unlocked something that would forever change the way people lived. Food safety, something the world had never truly understood, was now within reach. The process was simple, but the impact would be extraordinary. The word began to spread, first in whispers, then in louder conversations. Pasteur has found a way to save wine, to stop milk from spoiling. At first, people were skeptical. Could it really be so simple? But as more and more producers began to use the technique, the results were undeniable. Wine that had once been doomed to spoilage could now be preserved. Milk, once prone to turning sour within days, could be made to last. Farmers, winemakers, families, all began to see the difference. And soon they were calling the process by a name that would become famous around the world: pasteurization. Louis Pasteur, the quiet boy from a small countryside village, was now becoming a household name. People from all corners of France, and soon the world, began to speak of him with admiration, even reverence. This man, who had once struggled in school, who had faced ridicule and doubt, had discovered a way to protect their food, their drink, their lives. It wasn't long before his technique was applied on a grand scale. In dairy farms across France, in wineries, in breweries, the method of pasteurization became a standard practice. The impact was immediate and dramatic. People were safer. Children who had once fallen ill from drinking spoiled milk now thrived. Families who had lost money due to barrels of wasted wine could now sell their products without fear. It was as if Louis had found a way to protect the very essence of life itself. But even as the world celebrated, Louis, he wasn't done. For him, this was only one victory in a much larger battle. The invisible enemy, bacteria, wasn't just spoiling food. It was attacking people. It was spreading diseases, causing infections, and robbing lives. What else, he thought, can heat, can science do? Louis knew he had only scratched the surface of what was possible. Pasteurization was a triumph, yes, but there were still so many unanswered questions, so many diseases that remained a mystery. And so, while the world marveled at his discovery, Louis quietly returned to his lab. His hands, stained with chemicals, his mind full of ideas, he pushed forward. The battle against bacteria was not over, not yet. But for now, there was a moment of triumph. In a world that had once been at the mercy of spoilage, of invisible enemies lurking in every sip of milk, in every glass of wine, Louis Pasteur had brought light. He had shown that science could find the answers, could fight back, could protect. The process of pasteurization was humble, yes, but its impact was profound. It was the turning point that would forever change food safety, public health, and the way we understood the world around us. Louis Pasteur, the man who saw what others could not, had turned heat into a weapon, and with it, he had begun to save lives. But even now, as the fires of his discovery burned bright, his quest for truth continued. The fight against the invisible enemy was far from over. Chapter 9. The Race Against Disease. Louis Pasteur's name was spreading across France, across Europe, across the world. His discoveries had already changed the way people understood food and drink. Pasteurization had saved countless lives, but even as his fame grew, so did the challenges ahead. Because while he had fought, and won the battle against spoilage, a far deadlier war was looming. Disease, anthrax, cholera, rabies. These were not abstract dangers. They were real, terrifying, and devastating. They swept through towns, through farms, leaving death and destruction in their wake. And the worst part? No one knew how to stop them. Animals, people. It didn't matter. Disease struck without mercy, without warning. And Louis, he couldn't rest. His mind was always racing, always searching. He had uncovered the invisible world of bacteria, had seen how they could spoil food. But now, he understood something far more sinister. These tiny creatures weren't just an inconvenience. They were killers. But how could he fight them? How could he protect the people he loved, the animals farmers depended on, from an enemy so small, so powerful? The answer came not from treating the diseases, but from preventing them. But preventing disease was a challenge unlike anything Louis had faced before. He had already proven that bacteria could be killed by heat, that they were the cause of spoilage. But this was something else. These diseases didn't just spoil food, they destroyed life. Anthrax was one of the deadliest, a disease that swept through farms, killing livestock in the hundreds. One infection, one death, and the entire herd could be lost. Farmers watched helplessly as their animals, their livelihoods, fell victim to this invisible enemy. And then there was cholera. It spread like wildfire, especially in crowded cities, leaving devastation in its wake. Entire communities were gripped with fear, and all the doctors could offer was hope. Hope that the disease would pass, that they wouldn't become the next victim. And rabies, the most terrifying of them all. One bite from an infected animal, and there was no escape. The disease ravaged the mind and body, leading to certain death. Slowly, painfully. Once the symptoms began, there was no cure, no hope. Louis, he felt the weight of it all. He had to find a way. There had to be a way to protect people. But how? His mind spun with questions, theories, possibilities. He stayed up late, long after the candles had burned low, his desk littered with notes, his thoughts tangled in a whirlwind of ideas. The clock was ticking, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't. And then it came to him. Vaccination. The idea wasn't entirely new. Decades earlier, Edward Jenner had developed a vaccine for smallpox, using a milder form of the virus to protect people from the deadly disease. But could this principle be applied to other diseases? Could Louis find a way to use the very bacteria that caused illness, to stop it? It was risky, dangerous even, but Louis had no choice. The stakes were too high, the consequences of failure too devastating. He turned his attention to anthrax first. The disease had already ravaged countless farms, killing animals and destroying livelihoods. If he could stop anthrax, if he could prevent it from infecting animals, he could save lives. Louis began his experiments carefully, methodically. He took samples of the anthrax bacteria, weakened them, made them less deadly. And then he tested it. It was a gamble. If he was wrong, if the vaccine didn't work, the animals could die. But if he was right, if his theory was correct, the first trial was held on a farm with a group of sheep. Some were vaccinated with his weakened strain of anthrax. Others were not. The tension was palpable. Farmers gathered around, their eyes fixed on the animals, their hearts heavy with hope and fear. Days passed, and then the unvaccinated sheep began to show symptoms. They grew weak, and soon they died. But the vaccinated sheep? They lived. The experiment was a success. Lewis had found a way to protect animals from anthrax. The farmers erupted in cheers, their relief spilling over in waves of joy. And Lewis, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction, of triumph. But even as he celebrated, he knew this was just the beginning. Cholera, rabies, they still loomed, dark and menacing. He couldn't stop. The race against disease wasn't over. He turned his attention to cholera next. Working tirelessly, he developed a vaccine, following the same principles he had used with anthrax. The results were promising, but the battle against cholera would be long and complicated. And then there was rabies. Rabies haunted Louis. He had seen firsthand what it could do, the madness it caused, the slow, agonizing death. People lived in fear of a single bite from an infected animal, knowing that once the disease took hold, nothing could save them. But Louis, he believed there had to be a way. He began his experiments carefully, cautiously, knowing the risks. Rabies was unlike any disease he had faced before. It attacked the nervous system, hid deep within the body, waiting. And if his vaccine didn't work, the consequences could be fatal. But Louis had never been one to shy away from a challenge. He pressed on, testing, refining, experimenting. And then, one day, a boy was brought to him. He had been bitten by a rabid dog, and his family, desperate, pleaded with Louis to help. The boy hadn't yet shown symptoms, but time was running out. Louis faced an impossible choice. The vaccine was still experimental. If it didn't work, the boy would die. But if he did nothing, death was certain. With a heavy heart, Louis made his decision. He administered the vaccine, hoping, praying, that it would save the boy's life. Days passed, and Louis held his breath. The boy remained under close watch, every twitch, every movement sending waves of anxiety through the room. And then, the boy lived. The vaccine had worked. Louis Pasteur had done it. He had found a way to stop rabies, to prevent the disease from claiming another life. The world celebrated his victory, but Louis, he knew the race against disease was far from over. Anthrax, cholera, rabies, these were only the beginning. But now he had a weapon, vaccination. And with it, Louis Pasteur would continue to fight, to protect, to save lives. The race wasn't over, but Louis was winning. Chapter 10. The first victory, the anthrax vaccine. It was a race against time, a race against nature itself. Louis Pasteur stood in the fields, the sun beating down on him, his heart pounding in his chest. In front of him, a group of sheep grazed quietly, unaware of the storm brewing around them. These animals, they were at the center of an experiment that could change everything. Anthrax. The word alone sent shivers down the spine of every farmer in France. This deadly disease swept through farms like a plague, killing animals in a matter of days. It showed no mercy, leaving devastation in its wake. And no one had been able to stop it. Until now. Louis Pasteur, his mind sharp, his resolve unshakable, believed he had found the answer. He had been working tirelessly, day and night, experimenting, testing, refining his vaccine. He had taken the very bacteria that caused anthrax, weakened it, and turned it into something that could protect instead of destroy. But this was the moment of truth. Would it work? The tension in the air was palpable. Farmers gathered around the fenced-off area, their faces lined with worry, their eyes fixed on Pasteur. If he failed, they would lose more than just their animals. They would lose hope. Louis wiped his brow, his hands trembling ever so slightly. He had never felt the weight of expectation so strongly. The world was watching, and he couldn't afford to fail. He couldn't. The sheep were divided into two groups. One group had been vaccinated with Pasteur's new anthrax vaccine. The other, left unvaccinated, was vulnerable to the deadly disease. The bacteria had been introduced. Now, it was a waiting game. Days passed, each one dragging slower than the last. Every morning, Pasteur would rise early, his mind buzzing with questions, his heart heavy with anticipation. Would the vaccine hold? Had he done enough? The farmers watched anxiously. Their livelihoods, their futures, were tied to the outcome of this experiment. They whispered among themselves, glancing at the sheep, at Pasteur, wondering, could this man, this scientist, really do what no one else had done? Could he stop anthrax? And then it happened. The unvaccinated sheep began to fall ill. One by one they grew weak, stumbling as the disease took hold. The signs were unmistakable. Anthrax was spreading through their bodies, unstoppable, fatal. But the vaccinated sheep, they stood strong. Not a single one showed signs of illness. They were healthy, untouched by the disease that had ravaged the others. The farmers stood in stunned silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. Could it be true? Had Pasteur really found a way to protect their animals from this invisible killer? And then, a cheer erupted. It started quietly at first, a murmur of excitement rippling through the crowd, but soon it grew. Shouts of joy, relief, and triumph filled the air. Farmers clapped each other on the back, their faces breaking into wide smiles. They had seen it with their own eyes. The vaccine had worked. Louis, he felt his chest tighten with emotion. He had done it. His heart swelled as he watched the healthy sheep, standing strong, oblivious to the danger they had been spared. The unvaccinated sheep lay still, victims of the disease. But the vaccinated? They were living proof that his theory had worked. Vaccination, it was the key. In that moment, Louis knew. This was only the beginning. He had found a way to fight the invisible enemies before they could strike, before they could wreak havoc. And if he could do this with anthrax, what else could he prevent? What other diseases could he stop in their tracks? The possibilities were endless. The world was changing. Louis Pasteur had proven that science could not only cure, but it could prevent. And that was the real victory. As the farmers crowded around him, their voices filled with gratitude, with praise, Louis felt a deep sense of satisfaction. But it wasn't pride. It was something else. It was hope. Hope that the dark shadow of disease didn't have to hang over them forever. Hope that, with the right tools, the right knowledge, the right determination, humanity could stand up to the forces of nature that had once seemed unbeatable. But Louis, he wasn't done. Even as the crowd celebrated, he was already thinking about what came next. There were other diseases to tackle, other enemies to fight. Anthrax had been the first victory, but cholera, rabies, they were still out there, waiting to strike. The race wasn't over, but now, Louis knew he could win. He had unlocked a secret, one that could change the world. The idea of preventing disease, of using weakened bacteria to build immunity, was revolutionary. It was a breakthrough that would ripple across science, medicine, and the lives of people everywhere. The first step had been taken. Louis looked out at the fields, at the sheep grazing peacefully, the sun dipping low on the horizon. A sense of calm washed over him, but beneath it was a fire, the fire of discovery, of a mind that would not rest until every disease, every invisible enemy had been brought into the light. This was only the beginning. The anthrax vaccine had been a triumph, but Louis Pasteur, he wasn't done fighting. The road ahead was long, filled with challenges, filled with danger. But now, with this victory under his belt, he knew he had the strength to keep going. The invisible enemy had been exposed, and Louis Pasteur was ready for whatever came next. Chapter 11. The Battle with Rabies. But his greatest challenge was yet to come. Louis Pasteur had faced anthrax, cholera, and other deadly diseases, but nothing could have prepared him for the horror of rabies. Rabies, a disease that brought terror to every village, every city, a disease that attacked without mercy, a slow, agonizing descent into madness and death. Once the symptoms appeared, there was no cure, no hope. Pasteur knew the dangers. He had seen what rabies did to its victims. Once bitten by an infected animal, it was only a matter of time before the disease spread. Unstoppable. The body, the mind, both betrayed by a virus that could not be tamed. Louis had been working tirelessly day and night, trying to understand rabies. He had developed vaccines for other diseases, but rabies, it was different. It was more aggressive, more mysterious. It didn't attack the body in the same way. It lurked in the nervous system, hiding, waiting. There was no margin for error if his vaccine failed. And then it happened. A young boy, a child no older than 9, was bitten. The boy had been playing near the woods, laughing, carefree when a rabid dog attacked. The bite was deep, savage, tearing into his arm. His family, stricken with fear, rushed to find help, but they knew there was no cure. The boy's father, his face pale with desperation, heard whispers of a man named Louis Pasteur, who had saved animals from anthrax, who had brought hope to farmers with his vaccines. Could he save a human life from rabies? The family traveled for days, their hearts heavy with dread, clinging to the faintest shred of hope. And then they found him. They came to Pasteur's door, their faces lined with terror. "Please," the father begged, his voice cracking, "please, save our boy." Louis stood frozen for a moment. He had been working on a rabies vaccine for months, testing it on animals, carefully refining it. But it had never been used on a human before. It was still experimental, untested. If it failed, the weight of the decision crushed him. This was a child's life. The stakes had never been higher. His heart, heavy with the responsibility, Louis looked at the boy. The child's eyes were wide, filled with fear but also with trust. Trust that Pasteur could save him. Louis knew he had to act. He couldn't let this boy die, not when there was a chance, no matter how slim, that the vaccine could work. He prepared the injection, his hand steady, but his mind racing. What if it didn't work? What if it was too late? What if... But there was no turning back now. He administered the first dose of the vaccine, and the waiting began. The days that followed were some of the longest of Louis's life. Every morning, he visited the boy, checking for signs of the disease. Every slight movement, every breath the boy took, sent waves of tension through the room. His family stayed by his side, their eyes locked on Pasteur, hoping, praying. But rabies doesn't reveal itself immediately. It creeps through the body slowly, like a shadow in the dark, waiting to strike. And so, they waited. 2 days passed, then 3. The boy remained healthy, but Louis knew it was too soon to tell. Rabies could take weeks to show its terrifying symptoms. His heart pounded with every moment of uncertainty. The tension in the air was unbearable. Pasteur barely slept, barely ate. His mind was consumed by the thought of failure. What if he was wrong? What if this boy, this innocent child, would be the victim of his mistake? And then, a week passed. The boy showed no signs of illness, no fever, no confusion, no madness. He was healthy. The room was silent at first. The boy's parents looked at each other, at Louis, hardly daring to believe it. Could it be? Could their child truly be saved? And then, tears. The mother collapsed into sobs of relief, her hands covering her face. The father grasped Louis's hands, his voice trembling with emotion. You've saved him," he whispered, choking on the words. "You've saved our son." Louis stood still, his heart filled with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming joy. He had done it. The vaccine had worked. He had defeated rabies, one of the deadliest diseases known to man. The world had changed forever. News of Pasteur's success spread like wildfire. Scientists, doctors, and families across the world heard of the boy's survival, of Pasteur's miraculous vaccine. The unthinkable had been achieved. Rabies, the disease that brought certain death, now had a defense. The victory was monumental. Louis Pasteur had done more than just save a life. He had proven that science could stand up to the most terrifying of enemies, that even the deadliest diseases could be beaten. Vaccination wasn't just a tool to prevent illness. It was a weapon to save lives. The scientific community hailed Pasteur as a hero. The public, they called him a savior. But Louis knew that this victory, like all the others, was just another step. There were still diseases to fight, still lives to save. The battle against the invisible enemy was far from over. Yet as he looked at the young boy, laughing, playing again as if the shadow of death had never touched him, Louis couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of triumph. This had been his greatest challenge, and he had won. Rabies, the disease that had terrified humanity for centuries, had been defeated. And Louis Pasteur, the quiet boy from a small village in France, was now a name that would echo through history. The battle with rabies had been fierce, but science had prevailed. And for Louis, there was no greater victory than saving a life. The boy had lived, and the world had changed forever. Chapter 12. A legacy of life, from a quiet, curious boy in a small French village to a global hero, was not driven by ambition alone. No, what fueled his every step, his every discovery, was something deeper, something more powerful than fame or recognition. It was the love of life itself. From the moment he first gazed at the river as a child, watching the insects dance on the water's surface, Louis had been filled with questions. How? Why? What makes life work the way it does? Those questions never left him. They followed him through his youth, through his struggles in school, through his early days in Paris, and beyond. And Louis. He never stopped searching for answers. For him, science wasn't just a profession. It was a calling, a mission. Every experiment, every breakthrough was a step closer to understanding the world around him, to unlocking the secrets of life and using that knowledge to protect it. His work would save millions. Pasteurization had changed the way the world consumed food and drink. It had brought safety, health, and peace of mind to families everywhere. No longer would people live in fear of spoiled milk or soured wine. But Louis didn't stop there. His battle with disease, anthrax, cholera, and rabies, had revealed a truth that would change the world forever. That disease could be prevented. Vaccination, this powerful tool that Louis had refined and perfected, would become a weapon against the invisible enemies that had haunted humanity for centuries. Anthrax had been his first victory, a triumph for farmers and livestock, a beacon of hope for rural communities. But it was rabies that had cemented his place in history. When that young boy, bitten by a rabid dog, was brought to Louis's door, it wasn't just his scientific mind that made him act, it was his heart. He couldn't stand by and watch life be stolen by disease. And in that moment, when the boy lived, when rabies, this monstrous, deadly disease, was defeated, Louis knew that his life's work had only just begun. Because for Louis, it was never enough to stop at one discovery. He was always asking, "What's next? What more can we do?" He believed, with every fiber of his being, that science was a force for good, that knowledge was the key to saving lives, to protecting the vulnerable, to giving humanity a future free from the fear of disease. But Louis wasn't just a man of intellect. He was a man of compassion. He cared deeply for the people around him, for the farmers who depended on their livestock, for the parents who feared for their children, for the families who faced the threat of disease every day. That's what set him apart. It wasn't fame that drove him. It wasn't the accolades. It was the people. He knew that science had the power to change lives, and he dedicated his entire existence to making that change a reality. And so, a legacy was born. A legacy of life. Louis Pasteur's work didn't end with his death. Far from it. His discoveries, his methods, his relentless pursuit of truth would inspire generations of scientists, doctors, and thinkers to come. His name would echo through the halls of universities, through the pages of medical journals, through the hearts of every person whose life was touched by his work. His legacy wasn't just in the laboratories, though it certainly lived there. It wasn't just in the vaccines that would go on to save millions from diseases he never even knew existed. It was in every life that was spared, every child that lived because a mother didn't fear giving her baby milk, every farmer who smiled as his sheep survived another season, every person who walked through life without the shadow of disease hanging over them. That was Louis Pasteur's legacy. He had fought against the invisible enemies that no one could see, that no one even knew existed, and he had won. But more than that, he had given the world something precious. He had given the world hope. Hope that disease could be beaten. Hope that life, fragile as it was, could be protected. And hope that no matter how dark the world seemed, No matter how terrifying the unknown was, there was always an answer, always a way forward, if only we dared to look. Louis Pasteur's journey was one of determination, of unyielding belief in the power of science. He had faced failure, doubt, and skepticism, but he had never given up. He had never let the obstacles in his path slow him down. He had pushed forward, driven by a love of life and a desire to protect it. And in the end, he had succeeded. His work would go on to shape the future of medicine, of science, of the world itself. Vaccination, pasteurization, the very idea of preventing disease before it could strike. These were not just scientific breakthroughs, they were gifts. Gifts to humanity, given by a man who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. A world where disease was not a death sentence, a world where knowledge, not fear, guided our understanding of life. Louis Pasteur's story was one of triumph, but it was also a reminder that no matter how small we may feel, no matter how insurmountable the challenges before us, we all have the power to make a difference, to ask questions, to search for answers. His journey from a boy staring at a river to a man who saved millions is proof of that. And so, as we look back on his life, on his work, on the legacy he left behind, we remember. That legacy wasn't built on ambition or fame. It was built on love, the love of life itself. And Louis Pasteur will be remembered for as long as life exists. His legacy will live on. In every breath we take, in every life saved, in every moment we hold dear. The quiet boy from the countryside had changed the world.